8. Clarence and Carmen Jenkins. In 2008, a woman named Sue Bostic found a garbage bag with dismembered body parts inside it and a note full of threats on her car outside her home in Greenville, South Carolina. The note was addressed to Miss Bostic's niece, Grace Davis. But police were at a loss when it came to figuring out whose body parts were in the bag, why, and who could have put them there. Later that same day, another one of Grace Davis's relatives found a different bag filled with severed pieces of a body and a threatening note outside their home. Detectives determined the note was timed at a local library and found surveillance footage of the couple they suspected were behind everything. They also tracked down Grace Davis and showed her the video of the two individuals. She identified them as Clarence and Carmen Jenkins and said she'd been involved in a romantic throuple relationship with the pair for quite some time. Grace told investigators she left the unconventional arrangement because Clarence started to become extremely controlling. She wanted to get her troubled life back on track, and she knew she couldn't do it under his possessive thumb and watchful eye. Clarence was allegedly outraged by Grace's decision to walk away from him, and he refused to take no for an answer. But Grace claimed she didn't know anything about the dismembered body parts or why they were showing up on her relatives' doorsteps too. Using a fingerprint tracing database, police identified the body parts as 34-year-old Nicole Harris, a troubled single mother who struggled with drug addiction but was trying to get on the right path for her children. They obtained a search warrant for the Jenkins trailer, where they found copies of the threatening note, blood spatter, a suspected murder weapon, and other evidence connecting the couple with Nicole's death. Clarence and Carmen were later charged with murder. It wasn't until over a year later when Carmen finally decided to speak up and tell detectives her full version of events. She claimed Clarence was so angry about Grace leaving their relationship that he thought he could somehow win her back by intimidating her with these body parts. Carmen said her husband tried forcing her to kill Grace, but she wasn't strong enough to strangle the victim to death, so he ended up doing it himself. Then they brutally cut up her body. The case was recently featured in the Discovery Plus series American Detective. During the show, detectives said that Carmen's confession was awkward and stone cold, and that she showed no apparent emotion or remorse while recalling the events. She did apologize in court though, and managed to get her sentence reduced from 50 to 40 years. Meanwhile, Clarence is serving a life sentence without possibility of parole. 7. Joe Constance. On the morning of June 5, 2011, a man named Joe Constance shot his way into his estranged wife's home in Calcasieu Parish, Louisiana. He cornered several people inside, threatening to shoot and physically assault them unless they told him where his wife was. Constance eventually found his wife, 49-year-old Mary Duhon. He then shot her and fled the scene in his pickup truck after he was certain she was dead. A manhunt started almost immediately, but Constance was nowhere to be found. Some neighbors overheard the gunfire and saw people running, but they couldn't offer much in terms of valuable leads. Joe has managed to evade authorities for over 11 years now, making him one of the FBI's most wanted violent criminals. Constance was even featured on America's Most Wanted, in hopes that one of the show's million viewers might recognize him and help law enforcement find his whereabouts. But the plea for information led nowhere, and Constance hasn't slipped up yet. In a 2014 interview, the Calcasieu Sheriff Lieutenant Les Blanchard said his agency pulled out all the stops and used all resources available in their attempts to locate Constance. They searched by air and boat and even expanded their efforts to the bordering countries, Canada and Mexico, but came no closer to finding the fugitive. Constance's ability to remain hidden is extremely concerning given the violent nature of his crimes, and authorities still consider him armed and dangerous. They're hoping someone will spot him and come forward so they can hopefully take Joe off the streets for good. 6. The Chillicothe Killer. The small Ohio town of Chillicothe was left shaken when women started to mysteriously disappear in May 2014. Between then and late 2015, 6 women vanished, but only 4 bodies have been found. To further complicate things, many have accused law enforcement of grossly mishandling these cases. Mother of two, Charlotte Trago was the first to go. She was never seen or heard from again after her mother dropped her off at her apartment home one day. The disappearances continued on from there. When 30-year-old Tamika Lynch's husband called the police to report her missing, they told him there was no reason to suspect any foul play. After that, authorities ruled the suspicious death of 20-year-old Shasta Himmelreck a suicide. In the meantime, 26-year-old Tiffany Sire, 38-year-old Timberly Claytor, and 31-year-old Rebecca Cade all turned up dead, but authorities took little action. In 2019, Chillicothe Police Chief Keith Washburn and Ross County Sheriff George Lavender told the Chillicothe Gazette they were doing everything in their power to solve the cases they considered unsolved. They were not convinced the deaths were linked, even though the victims' families insisted otherwise. A task force dedicated specifically to solving these mysteries has still not formally named any suspects or made any arrests, which means that at least one very dangerous individual remains free to roam the streets. Washburn claimed it would be difficult to interview potential witnesses and people with information because several of the victims who ran in circles with people had so-called mental health and drug problems, in his own words. When past attempts were made to interview people, they showed up higher than a kite, which wasn't helpful for the case. 3 of the cases are now considered closed, but remain shrouded in questions and controversy. Many people are unconvinced the disappearances and deaths aren't the handiwork of just one person. 2 women remain missing, and 1 death is officially classed as an unsolved homicide. These women's stories were featured in the 2016 docu-series The Vanishing Women, which examined the circumstances surrounding each of the cases and law enforcement's alleged shortcomings in their responses. 5. William Devin Howell. In 2003, detectives were left baffled when 7 women went missing in Connecticut. They finally got a lead the following year when a convicted sex offender named William Devin Howell became a suspect in the disappearance case of a prostitute named Nilsa Arizmendi. She was last seen getting into Howell's van after she and her boyfriend humbly agreed to let him spend the night with them in their hotel room. Arizmendi's blood was found inside William's van, leading to Howell's manslaughter conviction. Other evidence, including footage of Howell engaging in bizarre acts with other women, indicating that Arizmendi might not have been his only victim. Howell insisted he was innocent. He even claimed he didn't kill Arizmendi and that her blood got on his van during a fight she had with her boyfriend. Because no other bodies had been found, authorities lacked the evidence they needed to charge Howell with other crimes. Weeks after he accepted a plea deal in exchange for a 15-year sentence in connection to Arizmendi's death, a hunter found the remains of several missing women in a wooded spot behind a strip mall. Detectives unearthed 7 bodies total. With the help of jailhouse snitches, prosecutors managed to secure several convictions against Howell, who's now serving 6 consecutive life sentences. Hopefully, he'll never be able to lay hands on a woman again. 4. Maryvale serial shooter. In 2015 and 2016, a gunman shot 12 people in Phoenix, killing 9 and injuring 3. He chose his targets at random, but seemed to favor one of the city's predominantly Latino neighborhoods, Maryvale. Police had little to go on at first. The little information they could give the public was just a vague description of the shooter as being either a white or light-complexion Latino man in his 20s. The case was about to go cold when suddenly a person of interest was arrested for unrelated charges in 2017. Interestingly enough, a witness came into the police station and identified 23-year-old Aaron Sucado as the shooter out of a lineup containing a person of interest to the unrelated crime. Investigators were then able to connect Sucado's car and gun to the mass shootings. They charged him with a slew of crimes, including 9 counts of murder. He pleaded not guilty though, and the case hit unexpected delays thanks to the COVID-19 pandemic. Saucedo's trial is set to begin again later this year. 3. The Cleveland Strangler. Anthony Sowell's life of crime started way back in 1989 when he kidnapped and assaulted a pregnant woman in Cleveland, Ohio. He served 15 years in prison for this and was released in 2005. Less than 2 years after Sowell regained his freedom, his neighbors noticed a foul odor coming from out of his house. They complained to the health department, but nothing was done, but the stench then continued to linger. Police finally got a warrant to search Sowell's property in 2009 and found the remains of 11 women. 2 victims were buried in shallow graves in the basement, and 4 were found on the home's 3rd floor. 4 others were buried in Sowell's backyard, and a human skull was found inside a bucket. Most victims were strangled, either manually or with a ligature. During the investigation, it was also discovered that Sowell had brutally assaulted 3 survivors who'd come over to his place to smoke crack cocaine with him. He was convicted of all 11 murders and sentenced to death, but died in prison last year in 2021 from a terminal illness. Sowell's disgusting crimes were featured in the documentary Unseen, which addresses the systemic marginalization that his victims and their families faced in their attempts to try and get help from law enforcement. The survivors and the loved ones of Sowell's victims sued detectives for mishandling their complaints and received a $1.3 million payout. But this does little to compensate for what many believe were needless and preventable deaths, let alone the immense suffering the families endured. 2. Michael Madison. In 2013, police in East Cleveland responded to calls about a foul odor in a Glenville neighborhood. It wasn't long before they found the bodies of 3 women, Sherelda Terry, Angela Deskins, and Shatisha Sheely. The women had been assaulted, tortured, mutilated, and strangled to death. Then their bodies were wrapped in garbage bags. Detectives connected the brutal murders to a convicted sex offender named Michael Madison. They obtained a search warrant for his home and charged Madison with aggravated murder and several other crimes after finding more evidence of human decomposition in his home. He coldly confessed to the crimes without showing any remorse. During his trial, he taunted and smiled at the victims' families, cementing his verdict. One of the victims' fathers, Van Terry, attacked Madison from the witness stand. Footage of the encounter went viral, with many commentators stating that they felt the assault was well-deserved. Madison's neighbor told the media that about a month before the killing, Madison threatened to kill women in the same way the notorious Cleveland strangler Anthony Sowell had a few years earlier. A jury convicted Madison of 13 charges, including murder, kidnapping, abuse of a corpse, rape, and being an ex-convict in possession of a weapon. He received the death penalty and appealed it, but a court upheld the sentence in the end. Madison is currently still alive, but awaiting his fate on death row. 1. The Grim Sleeper. A terrifying serial killer nicknamed the Grim Sleeper committed his first murder during the mid-80s in Los Angeles. He targeted vulnerable sex workers who struggle with drug addictions. After killing women, he dumped their naked bodies in alleyways and on roadsides. When the Grim Sleeper began his campaign of terror, multiple serial killers were also working in the area. In other words, detectives had their work cut out for them, and resources were spread very thin. It's unclear how many women the Grim Sleeper murdered before he took a hiatus from killing in 1988. His crimes continued to go unsolved after he continued his murder spree during the early 2000s. The killer claimed his final victim, though, 25-year-old Janisha Peters, in 2007. But it wasn't until 3 years later that the Grim Sleeper was finally identified as a man named Lonnie David Franklin Jr., thanks to breakthrough DNA technology. Using a method called familial or genealogical DNA, police searched their database for DNA profiles that had similarities to the Grim Sleeper's. They landed on Franklin's son, who was too young to commit most of the murders. But investigators took a closer look at Franklin himself and determined he was actually the killer. They searched his home and found hours of footage and more than 1,000 photos of multiple women. There are many lingering questions regarding their identities and connections they might have to the Grim Sleeper's crimes. But all signs point toward the likelihood that Franklin killed more people than the authorities ever knew about. He was convicted of 10 murders and 1 attempted murder, and thankfully it was enough to not only put him away for life, but to sentence him to death too. Franklin never lived to see his execution date though. He was found dead in his cell in 2020. His body showed no signs of trauma, according to officials, who said the Grim Sleeper's cause of death would be announced pending the results of an autopsy. but the results have yet to be released to the public, leaving the circumstances of this murderer's death a mystery. Thanks for watching. What would you do if you were being targeted by a killer? Let us know in the comments below and don't forget to subscribe. See you next time.